Hi, everybody. It's Bob Ost, and it's Friday, and it's November 11th. Happy Veterans Day, everybody. I hope that everybody has thoughts for and thanks for all of our veterans. Many of our, my father was a veteran, and this is as good as a reason as any for me to think about my father today. This is Theater Resources Unlimited, for those of you who don't know us, and we're an organization we're a not-for-profit 501c3 organization that is a service organization to help people in theater. Our specific mission is to help producers. We help aspiring producers. We nurture and develop producers, but we also help everybody else in the business understand the business, because without understanding the business, you're not going to do well in the business. You'll probably make a lot of mistakes. So we've been doing this now for, would you believe, 29 years? Those of you who never heard of us are going to be saying, what? You've been doing this for 29 years and I've never heard of you? And unfortunately, yes, that's the case. We've been around for 29 years, dedicated to serving the theater community. And when COVID hit, remember COVID? When COVID hit in March of 2020, we all were thrown into a tizzy and didn't know what to do with ourselves. And somebody convinced me to open up a Zoom account, and here we are. I opened up a Zoom account and said, okay, rather than pull the covers over your heads and stay in bed and be depressed, does anybody want to get together on a Friday and just talk about theater? And so that's what we're doing now. We've been doing that now for, this is the 131st consecutive week. Earlier conversations really focused on COVID and shutdown and the angst we were all going through, but we've evolved now into a world that is more open to live performance. Theoretically, we've moved into live performance. The questions that we're going to be asking now and going forward is how successful have we been in the return to live theater? Broadway has a lot of success stories. Broadway also has a lot of struggles that are going on, but Broadway's always had a lot of struggles going on. Our conversations have sort of been moving towards reopening of live theater, and I think my position on this, and a lot of people's, but not everybody's position, is that we really want to hold on to virtual. We want to hold on to what we learned during shutdown about the virtual medium, and how it can enhance what we're doing in theater, how it can be an option, something that in the name of this I call the toolbox, the toolkit possibly. So one of the people that I know, who happens to have been the chairman of the board of True for many years until he decided to go rogue and open up a business down in Florida. So I'm going to bring in Tom Polum in a second, and you're going to meet Tom. In fact, I'll just do it now. So Tom, hi. Tom Polum left True. Well, this isn't exactly right, but this is the way I can spin it.
I am still a member of True.
It can spin it. He left us to open up a business that had to do with virtual performance, which of course nobody understood what that was. This was pre-COVID. It was before COVID hit that Tom started streamingmusicals.com. And a lot of us were just responding with a huh? You're doing what? And it's proven to be very successful in many ways for his business in of itself, and also virtual performance has become something that we have, many of us, if not everyone, many of us have learned to embrace. And Tom, I'm going to push it over to you now and tell us a little bit about streamingmusicals.com, and tell us when it actually started and how fortuitous it was that you found a medium that was perfect for the world we were about to enter.
Yeah, well, thanks. It's great to be here at the 131st Zoom meeting with the True members. I'm still a member of True. I still have my card. And I was the chairman of the board for a while, which I enjoyed tremendously. But
by the way, I just want to say amazing. You were like a terrific chairman of the board. You
Oh,
were great.
thank you. So it was, at the end of 17 going into 2018, and I've always been a theater producer, theater director, actor many years ago, probably, things like that. But I was getting really frustrated with producing in New York because it was getting so ridiculously expensive. And like everything just was costing more and more and becoming impossible to really get commercial runs working, especially in the off-Broadway environment. Certainly Broadway has much bigger reach in terms of its marketing and the dollars that you spend, but as Bob alluded to earlier, Broadway's always had its issues, not a lot of success stories. And certainly from an off-Broadway perspective, there are very, very, very few commercially successful, financially successful off-Broadway shows. And I kept saying, I need to find another way of exploring new musicals because musicals are my passion. And I said, there's got to be a way to bring new work to the world and to get it, eventually licensed by the licensing houses and things like that, and to get it out there. And I just wasn't finding it because, developing things regionally takes time and takes money and often enhancement money and things that come along with that. And producing in New York is obviously very expensive. Producing off Broadway, a musical is very expensive. And I had done the Toxic Avenger, and I think we did everything right with that production, but still in the end, we were unable to make the money back for the investors. It has since gone into licensing and is getting productions and was doing extremely well until the pandemic hit when everything shut down, of course. But I kept thinking in 17 going into 18, there has to be another option to develop. And so we had tried for about a year working with Actors Equity and USA and SDC and AFM to try to come to some way of creating new musicals on film or creating virtual musicals that could then be introduced into the world. And, we spent almost a year negotiating with the unions to trying to make that happen. And ultimately, no one was at a place in 2017 going into 18 where they were even really understanding, like Bob said earlier, what is this streaming musicals thing? What are you trying to do with it? So no one, ultimately we ended up dropping working with Equity and SAG, or Equity and SDC and USA and AFM, because we just couldn't get everybody to the same table to have the same discussions.
This is a very important point. And this is something I wasn't planning on talking about today, but I've been trying to get a community gathering to talk about the evolution of the contracts, the agreements, and which includes some bumps in the road involving SAG-AFTRA and Equity. It's been very confusing for most producers, specifically, particularly at the beginning of shutdown. None of us knew what we were supposed to do. None of us could figure out whether we were is it Equity, is it SAG? So can you talk a little bit about that and the contracts that you used at first and what you're using now?
Sure. Well,
do you mind going into contracts? I hadn't planned on it, but I think it's important.
So having gone through the four unions that we were the theatrical unions for non-Broadway, what we realized it was just not going to happen. So we defaulted to the SAG-AFTRA agreement, and specifically the new media agreement, which was a newer agreement that came into play in the mid 2015, 16, 17. And it was a pretty easy contract to work with. The actors would make $125 a day plus pension and welfare and your taxes and all of that, and you were able to work 6 days a week to be able to create work. And so we decided to experiment with that, and we did a production of Paul Gordon's Emma, Jane Austen's Emma, and we did that in 2018, and we filmed it in a theater. So we actually went into the West Side downtown downstairs theater, and we filmed it over a period of 2 weeks. We had a 1 week of rehearsal and then 2 weeks of filming it, out of show orders. So more like a film it was made. We rehearsed an order, but then filmed it, location to location to location. So it was done more like a film, but we did live singing, which was not how most movie musicals are made. They're made with the pre-recorded songs. But SAG allowed us to go under that new media contract, which was pretty easy to deal with. And so we recorded Emma under that particular contract. And then that allows you then to release it onto the internet, into any new media platform, which does include things like Netflix and that. There are certain budgetary constraints that they hold you to. Under 50,000 is one range where you can defer payment to the actors. Up to 250,000 is another range where then you do have to pay the actors, but then you can stream in many different platforms. And then it goes from 250 up to, I think it's $750,000. That's another tier. And then above that is like the Netflix tier in areas where you're spending, a tremendous amount of money to create things. So the new media contract was designed to be able to allow this smaller work to be created. And it was a nice match for what we did with Emma, because we could create something in the well under the $250,000 range that was a good representative using New York Broadway actors who happen to be SAG, and be able to create something that had, which we called our minimal viable product, or MVP, which we could then use to see, okay, we've created this thing, now let's see what we can do with it.
I just want to interject one thing. Just for those of you in the room who don't know, there's also a SAG micro agreement. People by now should know not to call me now. So they have a micro agreement that is a lot less expensive than the regular agreement. The one that you're using. But it also is very limited in terms of what you can do. You can only, I think you can only stream for 4 days or something. I don't know. But I just want everybody to know that I'm planning on definitely having a community gathering, going over the new contracts, the new agreements. The thing that's controversial about what you're doing, what you're talking about, is that Equity was being territorial about that for a while, about any production that was deemed developed for theater, and they had to get into negotiations with SAG-AFTRA, and SAG-AFTRA finally, eventually said, or they agreed that SAG-AFTRA, if it was filmed, then the agreement could be done through SAG-AFTRA. You can't actually film anything now with the Equity agreements. At the beginning of shutdown, it was like, it was like a choice of whatever you felt you wanted to do, or could convince them to let you do.
Yeah, I think it was, it was very confusing for everybody that was involved, because no one predicted the pandemic was going to hit, and suddenly we went from having full theaters, or many shows in theaters happening, to nothing happening. And we were already working under SAG New Media, so for us it was easy to continue working under SAG New Media.
So the other thing, Tom, you may know this, because I'm trying to find this out. Equity was developing new media agreements for years. They had new media. They had new media agreements at one time. I don't know whether they're still functioning or not.
Well, as I said, we had spent most of in 2017 into 18 trying to resurrect some type of agreement for capturing theater. And at the end of it, after a year of meetings and discussions, I just finally realized this is never going to happen. We just kept, because it was, in full disclosure, it was a slippery slope with them. We came in with an offer, there was a counter, okay? Then there was another, then we upped our offer, then there was another counter, then we upped our offer, there was another counter. And it got to the point where it was going to become more expensive to do it under the Equity agreements than it was to go do it under SAG. So that's why we said, this is not going to make any sense. It's going to cost too much money. It's going to be unsustainable, and it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to create something on film, which is not attainable for most people. So that's why we went with SAG, because SAG was more reasonable. And then, of course, once the pandemic hit, then the war started between Equity and SAG, where Equity wanted to be in control of everything that was happening that was theatrical based. And SAG was saying, if there's a camera in the room, it's SAG. And that was the big argument that went on for a long time. We stayed clear of it because we were already working under SAG New Media. And we did, our last SAG New Media project was a live show that we actually taped or filmed in California at TheaterWorks, Paula Gordon's Pride and Prejudice, excuse me. And that was, we went in, we negotiated with Equity and SAG. We captured the show and paid Equity buyouts and USA buyouts and AFM buyouts and SDC buyouts. And then we also put all of the actors and everybody onto SAG contracts under New Media. And we created a show whereby we justified all of the Equity requirements, and we justified SAG to be able to then stream it under the SAG New Media. That was done at the holiday weekend, Christmas to New Year's in 2019 going into 20, right before the pandemic. And so, that was in development, it was in post-production, we were getting ready to release that film, and then March came and the pandemic hit. And for us, we were at a really opportune time because we knew our film was going to come out originally in April, and we were excited to release that in April. And since there was no theater happening in April of 2020, we suddenly decided, let's do this big online premiere of Pride and Prejudice. And in that weekend, we premiered it. It was available to watch, and we got 190,000 views of Pride and Prejudice in one weekend. And since then, Pride and Prejudice has been on Amazon for over a year, and Amazon Prime and other locations, and it's now been seen by well over 500,000 people in the period of 2.5 years. So that's really a success story for Pride and Prejudice, and we're currently in negotiations right now with a major licensing house to actually sell Pride and Prejudice to that licensing house for live production. So ultimately, what we set out to do in 2018, create theater by using a film medium that can ultimately be turned into stage productions, actually happened with Emma, because Emma was purchased by MTI, and then Pride and Prejudice is in discussion. And then two more of our shows have since now been purchased by MTI. Estella, Scrooge, which was done completely under the pandemic, and the show that I just premiered last week, 1660 Vine.
Which we're going to get to in a second. How many years does a show have to run on Broadway to be seen by 500,000 people?
It would be a very long time. I think that I remember the numbers from when Daddy Longlegs premiered, and Ken Davenport did that, and they got 150,000 views. That was the equivalent of 3 years of an off-Broadway run in one weekend. So, and Pride and Prejudice is still doing extremely well in Amazon. Amazon's algorithms are very interesting, and they know how to take things out of Prime and put it back onto their regular video on demand process. And it's actually, we've returned, without any live productions, we have returned 30% of the investment to the investors based on streaming alone from that particular property.
It's amazing. So for most of us, I think we've been going through a period of it's either or. And I think what we want to talk about today is how it can be both now. So that's 1660 Vine. Do I have that right?
Correct.
Okay. It's 1600 Pennsylvania Boulevard, but it's 1660 Vine. Got it. Okay. Just wanted to clear my head. What I'm curious about is, and I know that you don't have results on this yet, and so everything's theoretical. What made you decide to do a simultaneous live and virtual production for 1660 Vine? How did that happen? Was it something that you always thought you would do, or is it something that the opportunity suddenly was available to do?
Well, it was, it was interesting because it was, the writer and one of the producers of that, and one of my partners, live in Los Angeles. And so this project had been in development for about 2.5 years as a stage musical, and had a production at Duke University, a development production about two years ago.
Okay, so it started in live development.
Yeah, in college, in the university level, and it had a development through that. And then when the pandemic hit, of course, everybody was looking for, okay, how are we going to develop now during the pandemic? What are we going to do? That's ultimately why we did Estella, Scrooge the way we did that in 2020. But this production was originally slated to be in 2021, and then it was going to be completely completely green screen production, virtual, done the same way we did Estella. But then as it, a year ago, as it looked like the pandemic might be coming to a bit of a close and theater was starting to reopen very slowly, then we decided to wait a little bit and see what we could do to do more of a traditional film musical in that sense. So we ultimately ended up filming it in May and June of this year. But it was interesting because one of the producers, the one in California, just knew somebody at Hollywood High in California and mentioned we were working on this musical, which was about influencers and the effect of social media on young people, and said, well, that's really interesting because that might be really right for our high school, Hollywood High School in Hollywood, California. And they had read the script even before we filmed it and said, we're really interested in doing this. So that was just sort of a fluke that the live production, which is happening on December 9th, 10th, and 11th of this year, and the film ended up happening at exactly the same time. And then when we approached MTI about it as really a far reach, hey, we're working on this thing, which is sort of a new version of High School Musical about social media, they perked up and said, we're really interested in that. We'd like to know more. And so they reviewed the script over the summer.
Just disclaimer to everybody, it doesn't always happen that way.
No, this is no, and usually MTI can take 2 years to acquire something and go through the process. And I think it's because social media, especially on the heels of the pandemic, has become such an influence in our lives and young people's lives, especially with the bullying and all the things that happened, that they saw an opportunity for a live stage production that could speak well. And then in the development of the film, they would have a resource to be able to introduce people to the musical that would then create live stage opportunities for them. So it would really was a stroke of luck that it happened the way that it happened. It also was lucky for us that we had some heavy hitter names attached to the film that was very beneficial for us. The lead of the show itself happens to be the Prince of Cambodia, which they didn't know when they hired him. They just found out after they hired him that he actually happened to be a royal prince from Cambodia. And then we were lucky enough to get Paula Abdul as our choreographer, which opened a lot of doors and got a lot of attention on the film as well.
Well, let's take a step backwards for a second, because I want to go back to Estella Scrooge. Hadn't planned on doing this, but I kind of want to give people a sense of then and now. Estella Scrooge happened at a time when everybody was tearing their hair out about how substandard Zoom productions were, because everybody had to be in isolation, and it was talking heads and frames, and a lot of frustration about that, and a lot of people who Zoom what was it called? Zoom exhaustion. What did they? What?
Zoomsicles.
Well, Zoomsicles, but Zoomsicles were even harder, because making music happen on Zoom is very difficult, especially if you have anything more than a solo voice. But you had a vision for making, when you were shooting Estella Scrooge, we were still in isolation, and your performers had to be shot in isolation, correct?
Yeah, SAG did allow filming to happen in the zone system, zone A, B, and C, A being where the performers are, being where the technicians are, and C being outside of that area. But this was, we filmed it in August and September of 2020. That was way before any vaccines. That's when COVID was at its worst, and it was frightening. So we were planning to film it in that same time period in an actual studio theater, but I knew at the end of March going into April that was never going to happen. There was no way that there was going to be that we were going to be allowed to have actors in a room and actually film together. So we came up with this concept, working with our director of photography, Tyler Mill-Iron at Mill-Iron Studios, of filming each actor, one actor at a time, but using green screen technology and careful mapping of the eye lines, so that even though when you watch the film, yes, you can tell that it's green screen and you can tell that they're not actually in the location. But what we managed to do is that it does appear that the actors are actually looking at each other and talking to each other. And that's what actually made the essence of it work as a theatrical piece, because really we suspend belief when we see theater, because we know they're not in this location. They have fake sets around them and all that. In essence, that's what this Estella Scrooge was. It was the actors telling a story who were really looking at each other, and the eye lines all connected. And the fascinating about that piece, yes, there were a lot of two-person scenes, but there were several scenes where there were 16 characters on stage. And so to map the eye lines of 16 characters was incredibly painstaking slow. It would take between 4 and 5 hours for each actor to film one particular scene, because you would have to know, they would set up in the studio stands with little balls on them. This is character A, this is character B, this is character C. So when the actor was standing here and they would deliver a line, they would look at that tennis ball, they would look at this tennis ball, and then they would look at that tennis ball. And then when it was all edited together, it made it look like everybody was looking at everybody else and were actually in the room. And I do have to say that when you watch the film, you do suspend disbelief. And I do forget that these people were not in the same room together, but yet it feels very connected. And there were a couple of times where, you know, like they had to hand over a glass from one actor to the other actor. And of course, they weren't there in the same room. So the technician that was in the room would wear a green screen hand. The hand would go into the green screen, would take the glass, and the reverse would happen. The green screen would hold the glass and put it into the real hand for the next person. And that would all be then edited together to make it seem like we were actually in the same room at the same time. Never will do that again ever in my life, because it was 2.5 months of my life spent behind a Zoom window watching actors one at a time in a room with one technician trying to make a movie. And it was incredibly challenging, and I'm glad we did it, but we'll never do it again.
But you returned to Estella Scrooge a year later, and you did additional edits. Can you tell us what you saw that you thought you could do better?
Yeah, well, the thing was, is we filmed it in August and September, and then we edited it in the month of October and November, which to edit a full green screen movie in 2 months isn't simply not enough time. You really do need 6 to 9 months to really edit a film like that. So once the film was released, afterwards, we're like, well, we're going to go back next year and we're going to fix certain things that we know that can be better to enhance the film and make it even stronger. And also we made a few cuts in a few places and we were able to trim it because we were unable to really watch the film in its entirety until the release. And so we wanted to go back and make it a stronger piece, which, you know, I always say theater is never finished, it's just produced. The same with, I guess, our films, they're never really finished. They can always be re-edited and re-released as another version of it. I think that's why you see directors' cuts of films all the time.
So when did that change in terms of the required setups, the 3 zones? When?
Well, the 3 zones existed for a long time. We did it specifically because we were so scared that someone was going to catch COVID if we had a group of people in a room, and it was too risky. So we made sure that
Tom, you weren't wrong.
Oh, I know. So we made sure everybody was PCR, and that was when PCR tests cost $125 each. So I mean, I think all in all, we spent about $18,000 just in COVID testing alone to make sure that everybody was safe and everybody was secure. But the next film that we did was in April, and that was already, you know, after vaccines were already coming out. And at that particular time, SAG allowed you to have as many people in zone 8 as you wanted to have, as long as they were testing regularly. And even the rapid tests were starting to be accepted by that particular point, because back in August of 2020, PCR was the only test that existed. That's all that you could get. And it's the only test that SAG actually approved. So it was it was time consuming because you took a test and the results didn't come immediately. You didn't have them the next day. So the testing protocol was very intense. We had hired a company that sent tests to the person at home, and then we would have somebody drive around and pick up the tests and put them in and then mail them. So it was very complex, but in the end, a very safe process. And I'm happy to say that no one during Estella Scrooge got COVID or contracted COVID during that entire 9-week process that we worked on that film. So I was very, very happy with that. When we did,
and you had some amazing people in that too.
You know, we had Danny Bernstein and Betsy Wolfe and Patrick Page, Carolee Carmelo was, I mean, and also because there was no work at that particular time, nothing was happening. So, you know, when we sat down with the producers and we were all like, what's our dream cast? We made a list, and when we started, and Tara Rubin was our casting director on it, and we started making calls, and everybody was like, sure, I'd love to make a movie right now. I'm really not doing anything. So when we explained the testing protocol and how it was going to happen and how safe it was going to be, and the fact that you'd be picked up by a driver in a car with a plastic shield, the driver separating you from you sitting in the back of the car, and everything that was necessary to do to make sure everybody was as safe as possible.
So let me ask you this. the things that you were forced to do for Estella Scrooge because of the restrictions of COVID, how much of that was good learning experience, and how much of it have you taken into what you're continuing to do, or was it just stuff that you had to do then and you do it all different now?
Well, in April, when we did Burning Man, we still had, rapid tests were happening. We could have many more people together and all of that. And it was really up to the discretion of the producer at that point. SAG was starting to already reduce restrictions. They were allowing many more types of tests to happen. And so it was easier, but it was still difficult. And we did have 2 people that contracted COVID. Fortunately, they were on the crew and were able to easily replace them and get them out and put the people in the quarantine that was necessary. So it was still difficult, but it was a lot easier, and it didn't cost us $18,000 for COVID protocols like it did with Estella Scrooge. And now this time when we just did 1660 Vine, the protocols still exist. You still have to do the testing, but it's nowhere near as restrictive. SAG is no longer at questioning everything that you do on set, and so it's a lot easier to be able to get through it. It's sort of the same system that the live stage unions went through in terms of how strict it was really when theater first came out, and everybody having to wear masks and audiences having to wear masks, and all of that is slowly starting to get a little easier, and some theaters require it and some theaters don't. I think the biggest burden on live stage production is the number of extra understudies and standbys that you have to be able to keep a commercial production running, and the rehearsals for those people, and the ability to just make changes at the fly when somebody comes down with COVID. So, if you have a Broadway show running right now or an off-Broadway show, Broadway is, you can absorb some of those costs because your margins are so much higher. But in an off-Broadway show, like for example, when Toxic Avenger had 5 characters in it and 2 understudies, one to cover the 3 men and one to cover the 2 women. Well, if 2 people came down with COVID and both of them were a man, what would you do? Because you wouldn't have a cast to be able to perform. So we would probably have to have brought on another understudy, or in the case of that show, you probably would have to have 5 understudies standing by for the 5 actors that were going to.
I would have had Nancy Opel do the man's role. She could do she could do anything.
Yes.
I'm going to check and see if remember, everybody, you can put questions into the chat as we go along. I was going to ask you something about yes, the green screen. Well, which technologies that you use with Estella are still relevant? I mean, green screen technology is still useful for some kinds of productions that we want to do virtually, I would think. And I think that when you did Emma, didn't you use some green screen backgrounds for that as well?
There were no green screen backgrounds in Emma at all. There were some green screen background. I mean, there was all green screen in Estella Scrooge, and there are selective green screen backgrounds in 1660 Vine. There are a few times when we wanted to film, and I guess this is probably a limitation of COVID, because we rented a location in Hollywood that we used for the filming of the movie. But there were a couple of locations, like a girl's supposed to be sitting in an Italian villa. Well, that wasn't going to happen because we weren't going to be able to go to another location. Even if we scouted something in Los Angeles, we weren't going to be picking up the circus and moving it to different locations, because the exposure to COVID is going to be a lot more risky when you're moving around all the time. So we had selective locations that we did green screen on in 1660 Vine. But there's really only a couple of times in the film where you'd be able to know that it was a green screen location, because we've also gotten, I think, better at doing that.
Well, let me ask you this. Just conceiving of a show for media, for a virtual medium, you have to think in a whole different way. You have to do setups and all that. And so isn't that like one of the things that you learn from going through this? Actually, I guess from streaming musicals from the very start, you have to think in things in a different way than you think of them when you're staging them. I'm talking to you as a director, because I know you also direct for stage.
I think that's a great question, because ultimately, when you're making a movie, when you're making theater, you rehearse in a studio. You have your designers, you develop your design, you go into tech, you discover things, you make things happen. You go into previews, and the previews help further develop the show, and you get to an opening night. With film, you have to be thinking about, okay, the final film is opening night, but what you capture in the principal photography phase is what you capture. You can't keep going back and saying, we're going to continue to develop this in the preview process. Yes, you can make edits to the film, but in some senses, making a film musical means that all of the departments, the director of photography, everybody working on the edit, have to understand what the end product is going to be, and everybody has to work together to be able to make that happen, because there's not a lot of discovery that can happen after you filmed all the actors, because that's what you have. And you've got to make that work. So you need to make sure going into the principal photography that you know everybody's on the same page and you know exactly what you want to achieve.
So I just wanted to throw one more thing in before I go to some of the questions. What was the relationship between the stage version of 1660 Vine and the virtual production? What resources were shared? What had to be done all over again or rethought?
Sure, we did. The Duke production was done, and a lot was learned from that production. A lot of songs were replaced, and a lot of the show was moved around, and things were changed. And then we used a series of table reads where the actors came together, new actors that were hired for this particular production. Some just table reads to get together to hear the material and to see was the new material working. And then there was a big table read about a month before before the production actually started filming, where a tremendous amount of work was done on the script to try to get it into the shape, into the shooting script that was necessary. So it was developed obviously as a theater piece originally, but also knowing that, and especially what Streaming Musicals does, is we're developing things not to really be feature films. We're developing them to be showcases for a theatrical production in the future, ultimately with the goal of selling to a licensing house, Music Theater International or Broadway Licensing or Concord or whatever the case may be. And since we had the success with Emma of actually being able to use the film of Emma, and MTI then purchasing that because they understood that this can be a theatrical show, having had that done, we knew that the future of streaming musicals for us is to develop things, always knowing that we are looking at the live stage licensing life. Because unless you're Netflix or Disney Plus or whatever, you're never going to get the kind of distribution that you would get being one of those big players. So really, it's a sales tool, it's a calling card, it's a workshop production on film of a theater piece. Some of them look more like films, some of them look more like Emma, which is a soundstage production. But in the end, ultimately, it's about using the medium of film, which provides us to the ability to do these shows at a reasonable cost that once is in the can and once is filmed, doesn't have a weekly ongoing running cost like you would if you were in a theater, having to pay everybody going forward. So as a developmental tool, it allows you to achieve, in the case of Emma and in the case of Estella Scrooge, and in the case of 1660 Vine, a show that is ultimately sold to a licensing house, Music Theater International, for a fraction of the cost of what it would have been to put that show on the live stage. And ultimately, if getting the show to live stage is the goal, then getting there, if you can get there for a fraction of the cost, makes a lot of sense.
Well, we're going to have a conversation about licensing in second week in December, and this is going to come up then as well. What is the budget for 16? Let's talk about 1660 Vine again. The budget for that, was that one budget that covered both aspects of it, live and virtual, or was it produced two different times essentially?
They're separate because there was a live stage, the Duke production, which was separate from everything, and then we acquired the rights to make a movie, to make an audio-visual capture of a production. And then there is the live stage development costs, which are another thing, like with Hollywood High, the costs of orchestrations and all that, that's a separate group. So if you're looking at just the film itself, that's the one piece that I particularly worked on, was the creation of this particular film. And under SAG New Media, we've always tried to keep those budgets at the 250 range. An interesting thing, going back to your conversations about union contracts, is SAG surprised us this year with 1660 Vine, saying that they are no longer allowing the use of the SAG New Media contract for productions that are under $750,000. So that was a surprise to us. What they've done now is they have this contract called the UPA, United Production Agreement, which has a cap of $300,000 and allows you to use the film also for theatrical release, limited, and also for online for new media. Different from the SAG New Media contract, which wouldn't allow us to go into a movie theater because it was only created for new media. So the difference is the actors make a little bit more money. They make $216 a day as opposed to $125, but it gave us the flexibility to put 1660 into a movie theater, and it just finished its 1-week run at the Lumiere Cinema in Los Angeles because it was under the UPA contract. Why is SAG not allowing the new media contract for anything under $750,000? I don't know. I asked SAG that question directly, and they just said, this is what we're doing now. This is how it is. So cool. Even SAG makes decisions that they won't give you a reason why. It's just the way it is.
And sometimes the individuals may not necessarily agree with the decisions as well. Right. So the licensing question I was going to ask you is, standard wisdom is that licensing companies aren't really interested in you unless you have a New York run. It's been disproven a lot over the years. And then there was a musical called Lunch, which was phenomenally successful and never had a New York production. There are others as well. What do you think it is about the shows that you've licensed that haven't had New York runs that attracted the licensor?
Well, first of all, I think it's always the quality of the show. The show has to be a very good show in order for the licensing houses to be interested, because they need to understand that they think that there's going to be a life for this. So that's one. And then two, I think in the case of the virtual productions, it's the quality and the talent in the virtual production that makes it, because it gets eyes on the product. And and Estella was attention getting because of the cast that we had, Lauren Patton, and I mentioned earlier, all these other people. So that was interesting to them. And also John Caird and Paul Gordon, John Caird, Tony Award winner, things like that. That helped the cachet of the project. So it has to be good. The quality of your capture has to be interesting to them, and enough quality that it knows that people are going to watch it and see the good quality of it and understand what it can be. So those two things have to work in conjunction. And then it's just, I think we got a little lucky with MTI and 1660, because there's hardly any new work really happening right now. So it was easy for us to slot in, here's a new musical that's going to speak well with young people, for example, because how many new musicals have come out in the last 2.5 years? Not that many. And I think that regionally, I think if you look around what people are doing regionally, new work has always been scary, but new work on the heels of COVID is really scary. Like what show is Paper Mill Playhouse doing for their Christmas show? They're doing the Sound of Music, because that will sell lots of tickets. And so you're seeing a lot of 42nd Streets and things, and Hello Dollies and shows that are going to sell to audiences, because people are still nervous to go to the theater. Even when I go to Broadway and see a show, I'm still, if the theater is full and I'm sitting through if the person next to me coughs, I'm like, okay, I feel really nervous now. So and I think that stigma is going to stay with us for a while.
I just saw a strange loop last week. Gary and I were the only two people masked in the theater. Well, probably not the only two, but maybe 2% of us in the theater were wearing masks. And I just don't understand that, because how can people be putting the actors at risk like that? Forget the fellow audience members. I mean, a lot of people feel like, oh, COVID, well, I'll just be sick for a couple of days. I might be sick for a week. I might be a little fatigued. It's no longer perceived as being deadly, although it has been deadly for some people still.
It certainly has. I mean, Nick Cordero was our first Toxic Avenger the only toxic Avenger, and of course he died of COVID early on, and and that was quite sad. I mean, I think there's a lot of it is COVID fatigue. People are so tired of it. I know I'm tired of it. I know that when we were in the studio for 1660 Vine in October doing the sound mix, and I had to wear that mask the entire time. I just, for 6 days, 12 hours a day, I'm like, this is exhausting, and we're tired of it. And I think that the general public just is like wants to rip the mask off and not care about it anymore. But we're going into flu season, and we're going into a new, what is it, XB variant of COVID. This is still with us, and it's going to be around for a while. And I think that you're seeing that the unions are still requiring the testing. SAG still requires the testing to be there to make sure that at the very least, that the people that you have on set are COVID negative that particular day.
Well, you mentioned earlier the unspoken COVID protocol that's happening in commercial theater. I mean, nobody's requiring it, but everybody's packing in understudies just so that they're covered. Because when, of course, you can't do anything when Hugh Jackman and Sutton Foster get sick. And what are you going to do?
Yeah.
So you shut down. But there are the COVID protocol now is to have enough understudies so that if somebody gets sick, you don't have to shut down the performance.
Right.
But I still think that as a courtesy to the production, audiences should be more willing to be masked. That's me. I mean, I'm sure people disagree.
Yeah. We just filmed for Daryl Roth Between the Lines in a theater in September, and that theater still required masks to be worn the entire time for the audience, and I think it's very safe, and the crew was wearing them backstage, and that was a beautiful production that we were able to film. We just came in to film the production on the stage, so we didn't we had nothing to do with the producing of that particular thing. But Daryl wanted to have a nice comprehensive capture of that show, which was different than B-roll. I mean, I think over the last 2.5 to 3 years, our company has developed into two areas. One where we develop things that for film that can be licensable, and also we've become quite good at coming in and capturing shows, because what we do is we capture a live performance or a second live performance, but then we also capture a rehearsal with no audience, so we can bring the cameras up onto the stage, and as I always say, make the viewer of our films look at it and feel like you've got the best seat in the house, not the worst seat in the house, often when B-roll is filmed from the back of the theater, because B-roll often feels like you're sort of a voyeur watching the show rather than being involved in it. And for Between the Lines, we took a crane and a jib and a Steadicam and brought them onto the stage, so you get those close-ups, so you can really see the actors up close at pivotal moments in the show. So those kinds of captures for us are really exciting. We also did Golden Cage, which was done, is going to be releasing next year from Deborah Henson Conant, and we also helped Bruce Lazarus capture a workshop of his, where he was then able to go out and raise investment based on the film that we made of his workshop.
I'm thrilled that you're doing Deborah's show. I mean, she was developing that through our workshop.
The capture of Golden Cage is stunning to look at.
Wow.
I can't wait for that to be released in February of next year, because it's so beautiful. And that piece should have a life, especially with small opera houses. It's a two-hander it's a beautiful story about the discovery of love between these two bird characters, utterly human characters. And it's a stunning piece, and I'll be so excited when that gets released, and so excited for Deborah.
So just to insert one other thing, anybody who's still not clear about how different the stage and the film media are, consider what it's like when you do a one camera capture of a show, and what that looks like when you view it. The film experience is just very different, and it involves a lot of thought and a lot of rethinking in terms of films and film terms. We're going to be talking about this again on December 2nd, just so you know. Stuart Lane and Bonnie Comley are going to come, and they are the people that are the founders of Broadway HD. And we're going to have a similar conversation. They're also talking about ways in which they're simultaneously developing new shows for stage and for capture, for live capture. I'm going to go to the questions in the room now. Elizabeth Copeland asks sort of a variation of something we touched on before. What's the most important lesson learned from the early days of Zoom? Any surprises? And I would also say anything that you're bringing with you into the future as you're continuing.
Well, I think for virtual production, using Zoom as a virtual development tool is really valuable. Using that to hear a play or to talk with actors about the development something, or to meet with your designers or whatever. As a development tool, Zoom is fantastic. As an end product to present something, Zoom is very difficult because the separation of the windows, you know, the Brady Bunch approach to everything makes it very, very difficult to connect, to make human connections in that particular space. I know really early on, there was a lot of Zoom work that was happening, and I think that audiences got very exhausted quickly on because what was missing was the human connection between two actors looking at each other and really communicating, as opposed to right now where, you know, Bob's talking and I'm talking, we're all talking at each other necessarily rather than talking to each other and with each other. So we realized pretty early on that Zoom was going to be a fantastic development tool, but as a performance tool, it probably wasn't going to last very long, and it was going to need other aspects. And that's why with Estella Scrooge, we're like, okay, if we're going to do this, it needs to make it so that the actors seem that they're actually talking to each other.
Another bugaboo of mine is I hate when people want you to actually watch in speaker view when you're watching a play, because I do not like seeing a full head on the screen, then another full head on the screen, and then another full head on the screen. I would rather watch it in gallery view, and even though you and I are next to each other and we're talking to the camera rather than to each other, it's easier on my eye to see the two of us, or to see 3 actors, or to see 5 actors in a row in the frames. I can't stand it when, and that's personal, I'm sure, but I can't stand it when it's full screen of one face, then another face, then another face. It also has no visual continuity for me. It drives me crazy. Next question is, Maureen Condon wants to know whether you're producing live shows as well, or are you focusing on your virtual business right now?
We're really focusing on the virtual, to develop virtual for live. We're not really producing live because, you know, the process of producing something for film and virtual is as long, if not longer sometimes, than producing on the stage. So we've really pivoted into that. Where we have been involved in live production is like the situation with Daryl Roth, where we came in and captured a show that is already live, and we're just coming in as an add-on to that. But no, we're not focusing on producing anything for the live stage right now.
Okay, Paul Smith has an interesting question, and this is more to you, Tom, as producer, than necessarily the guy that founded streaming musicals. When you were casting understudies, how do you manage to make a stage actor feel comfortable with only being cast as an understudy for the role and not the top candidate for the role itself?
Well, first of all, understudies often cover multiple roles, and in some senses, your understudies often are equally, sometimes if not more talented, you know, especially swings. I mean, and the value of the swings and the understudies was always greatly under-recognized, but now with COVID, for somebody to be able to have to cover 5, 6 roles and 7 roles, 8 roles, and just be able to step in at any particular moment, understudies and swings are probably the backbone of how theater is surviving right now. Without them, shows would be canceling left and right all the time and refunding performances. So I think that prior to COVID, getting someone to take an understudy position or a standby position or whatever had its challenges, but now I think that there's a great respect for those people. And I think that they also get compensated generally a little bit for each of the times that they go on in terms of what they do. So, you know, I have a good friend of mine that's, she's been a Broadway swing, and I think in like her 11th Broadway show now. She's more valuable in the swing position because they know she's trustworthy, and she keeps working. She goes from show to show to show to show to show because she's reliable, she's trustworthy, and they know if she's in there, they don't have to worry about it. So I think they're incredibly valuable people, and those of them that can do it well are worth all their weight in gold.
Paul, there's a lot of wonderful, wonderful, talented people out there who don't have a star recognition at this point. You're not going to ask Sutton Foster to be an understudy. You're not going to ask Hugh Jackman to be an understudy. But other people, as frustrating as it might be for them, they also appreciate the fact that it's a job, it's work, and it's a paycheck for them. So I do know. I was at a party, not a party. I was at a shiva last week where they were talking about how they made choices in their careers never to accept another understudy role. There are a couple of actresses that some of you may know. It's a choice. I mean, an actor who's offered an understudy role, sure, they wanted to get the role itself. So it's always going to frustrate them. But in our world, where we're dealing with people on a not as high profile a situation, I don't know. Your actor has the right to say yes or no. I mean, I don't think there's any shame in offering somebody an understudy role.
No. Bob, can I just say before we might lose a few people, this Christmas we are releasing Estella Scrooge on Vimeo for free, and I'm going to put the link into chat. Anybody here tonight that wants to see Estella Scrooge can do it for free at our Vimeo link using the code free at checkout. And also for 1660vine.com, we're offering a 25% discount using a code TRUE1660. So you can purchase or rent the film at streaming musicals, not Broadway on demand and not Vimeo, but I'm going to put that into the chat now. So if anybody would like to explore Estella Scrooge, they can see that for free. Again, using the code free at checkout, and 1660 Vine, we're offering a 25% discount if anybody wants to take a look at that.
So send that to me.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Kate.
Send that to me so I can put it into the newsletter as well. Jane, were your cost questions addressed at all? Which cost information did you want to share? You can turn on your mic and just say.
I think they were covered. I was just looking for just a general roughly how much the film would cost, and assuming that it's a cost effective relative to doing some sort of live development run.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Yeah, when we were doing the new media, we were forcing them 250 and under, which is tough. Under the UPA, which is a new agreement, that's 300. You can take UPA up to 700,000. It just has a higher tier for the actors. But comparatively, knowing how much it costs to produce a musical for the off-Broadway stage, and not to mention Broadway, these numbers are much, much smaller than you would be if you were doing a show at New World Stages, for example.
Lisa asks, can you talk about process length and cost of filming using a soundstage versus capturing a live stage performance on traditional film?
Yeah, sure.
Big difference.
We did the three recently. We did the Bruce Lazarus Project, his story, and we did Between the Lines for Joe Roth, and then Deborah Conant's Golden Cage. And those costs are really, in a big thing of things, very inexpensive, under $50,000, and sometimes well under $50,000, depending on the complexity of the capture. And then, of course, producing something on a soundstage like Emma or Estella or 1660, you're in that $200,000 to $300,000 range, depending on the complexity of the production. It'd be easy to spend a lot more. One of the things that we've been trying to do at Stream Musicals is find very economical ways of doing it. In terms of the time frame, capturing something live on the stage is for us going in for 3 or 4 days, capturing it, and then having 2 months of edit. And in terms of developing something, we're talking about having at a minimum 6 to 9 months, and generally a year or a little bit more to actually do a film of something and develop it.
Okay, Jeffrey Lyle Siegel wants to know about the cost of capturing a workshop. A lot of us are authors with shows in development who believe we could move them forward with better presentational tools. I can tell you the first thing that anybody will tell you is don't ever do a 1-camera capture. It has to be at least 3.
Yeah, generally at least 3, and we often do 5 or 6 cameras for a live performance. And then we often do, as I say, one of the things is we capture a rehearsal as well, which Equity now understands is important to the process, and they usually work in the fee for a capture of a rehearsal as opposed to a capture of a live performance. And I'm glad that they've made those transitions now, because it allows us, it's only better for the piece, and it's only better for the representation of the piece and the future use of that recording, whether it be to elicit interest of other theaters or elicit interest for tours or whatever, or interest for licensing or whatever the case may be, or commercial usage if you're willing to pay the fees that are associated with that. So a one camera capture of something is useful, I think, if you want to go back and review it and say, what actually happened. But to ask anybody to sit and watch a one camera capture of something and take away from it what your piece was intended to be is really quite difficult.
Which involves another thing that everybody has to really, I mean, I'm sure it's obvious, but editor. I mean, suddenly the technical person, the editor, is a huge part of the process now. And the editing process can probably take a long time too. If you're capturing film from all these angles and the rehearsal and this and that and the other thing, do you sit down with the editor and talk about where you want to pick the shots from?
We generally, I mean, we have very good editors, and generally what happens is if the director of the project will have a conversation with the editor about what's the feel, the theme, the tone of it. And then you develop what's called a rough cut. And that rough cut is then reviewed by the producers and the director and the choreographer and the authors. And, you know, they watch this rough cut and everybody makes comments on it. And then you make adjustments to that rough cut. And you sometimes have a second rough cut, or you work toward a fine cut. Once you have a fine cut, one that's really close to what you think it's going to be, you finalize your notes, and then you have a locked cut. Once you have a locked cut, then it goes to the sound department. And then the sound department does all of the mixing of the sound to make the locked cut look perfect, while the locked cut is being color corrected and titles are being put in and all that sort of thing. So the fastest I've ever seen the process happen from end of photography in our world is about 2.5 months from the end of the capture to the film being locked with picture and sound. That's really fast. That's for capturing something on the live stage. If we're actually filmed something like 1660 Vine, that's more like a minimum of 5 months minimum, and 7 to 9 is not unheard of. You know, feature films take often more than a year in the editing process to be able to be turned into what they're turned into.
Let's see. Lisa's asking a question that I don't think has an answer yet. I think the whole idea of stage productions and filmed versions of it being developed to complement and help each other is new. I know that I asked the question. I have asked the question of Bonnie Comley with Broadway HD, and she said that they're learning. They're just finding out what works best.
Yeah, I think that's the best answer. You know, certainly streaming musicals is learning. We started with one vision of what we thought we were going to do. That's really split into 2 different versions of it, capturing existing properties on the stage and then developing things as films for the stage. They're 2 very different paths. I think, you know, I totally respect Broadway HD and what they've done and the captures of the Broadway entities that they've done, because, you know, capturing Broadway as a whole another thing, because there are 18 unions involved, and it's a huge amount of buyouts that need to happen to be able to capture something like that. But the Broadway HD captures are beautiful. The captures they've made in London are extraordinary, and my hat's off to the wonderful work that they're doing.
I almost had them on with you, but I decided to give you each a community gathering platform. One last question from Michelle Rissy. If a person decides to work with streaming musicals, do they forfeit any ownership? You mean specifically? I think she means specifically with your company. What is the ownership in terms of the writer when they work with you?
It depends on. Yeah, it depends on if we're actually producing and developing, or if we're just capturing. In the case of like Between the Lines, we came in. We were guns for hire. We created a film that we then hand over to her, so she creates and does whatever she wants with it after that. In terms of 1660 Vine, Estella, Scrooge, and Emma, and Pride and Prejudice and others, we are the production team. So we're actually there producing the show, and then we make arrangements for subsidiary rights participation and things that are different in each particular case, depending on the author, because of the life we're bringing to the piece. Emma interestingly enough, Emma was licensed by MTI in 2019 in the summer, and it had 6 live productions that were slated to happen in 2020, all of which got canceled. But if all of those 6 productions had actually happened in 2020, we would have recouped all of the investment that was made to make Emma into the film. So in essence, the investment that was done was like launching the show in an off-Broadway environment, except we did it through a film, which was then acquired. The rights were acquired by MTI.
And Larry just wants confirmation for a live capture of an onstage performance, such as the Golden Cage. You were still using a SAG contract, not an AEA contract, correct?
Well, in the case of Golden Cage, which is very interesting, it was extremely inexpensive because she was using opera people. They were not equity, and they were not SAG. So we were able to capture the entire thing without using SAG members or equity members, and it made it extremely reasonable to produce.
Okay, well, I'm going to wrap up unless if somebody wants to raise a hand, if you have a question before we leave, do so now.
Bob, could I say something, or this is Walter?
Okay, well, okay, Walter, yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been so great. Here's what I wanted. Tell me if this is true, that just the capture itself, with the different dollies, and even if you had a drone within the theater of a live performance, that obviously you have plenty of time to know exactly what happens through the rehearsal period. Even with a single camera, you can study it. You're not surprised by anything, you understand? And the dissolves, that it offers a whole new level, a whole new world of creativity just in the capture itself of the live musical. Is that true? Is
Yes,
that
it is
exciting?
true. First of all, something always surprises you because you never know what's going to happen. Even as well prepared as you are, something always surprises you. And we have used drones to capture as well, and drones are extremely valuable. But I think what you're hinting at is the way you use the camera, whether it be on a dolly, which we often don't use dollies, but whether it's on a jib or a crane or a Steadicam or a drone, allows another level of storytelling that can support the strength of the piece. The director, Jeff Calhoun of Between the Lines, specifically sat down with the camera people before the capture and said, these are important moments. I want to capture this a certain way. I want to make sure I feel pulled into this moment. And that was really helpful because Jeff has both a filmic sense and a theatrical sense. So he was able to combine the two. And also all of our editors that we work with, Tyler Milliron, Isaac Benelli, and all these people, they're all from the theater as well. And I think that helps when you're capturing theater to have people who are intimately aware of how theater works and how theater is important in certain ways, rather than just thinking, hire a bunch of camera guys who are IATSE camera guys and come in, are going to just turn the cameras on and point them where you tell them. Having artists behind the cameras as well is really, really helpful. And that's what we've been always striving to do. Again, I say that with streaming musicals, we want you to feel like you have the best seat in the house, not the worst seat in the house.
So Tom, just for my YouTube and podcast viewers, give us the URL for streaming musicals so that they can check out all that you have to offer there.
Sure, it's very simple. It's streamingmusicals.com, or with the www, I'm putting it in the chat. That's it. Very easy.
But my YouTube viewers aren't going to see the chat, so I wanted to get it.
www.streamingmusicals.com. Very simple. Or you can go to 1660vine.com and it'll lead you to streaming musicals, or just Google streaming musicals and it will come up.
Okay, so thanks, Tom. Thanks for being with us, and that I always depend on you for so much, and thank you for being there for True and for me for all these years. I appreciate it very, very much.
Well, thanks, and please enjoy Estella Scrooge as a holiday gift at Vimeo. You'll enjoy that, and I think 1660 Vine's going to have a big future for itself. So we're excited about it.
So everybody out there in YouTube land and podcast land, please consider being part of the room. Join us, come in and visit us on Fridays at 5 o'clock Eastern time. And if you want to get invited to this and be part of the conversation and be in the room, go to send me an email at trunltd@aol.com. That's trunltd@aol.com. We'll send you the Zoom every week. And the other thing I'd like to remind everybody is that we've been doing this for 2.5 years as pay what you can. We are a business to some degree. We have to make money. We have to pay bills. So if you ever feel inclined to donate to us, you can go to trudonate.com, trudonate.com. So please consider being generous with us when you can. And as we're heading towards the end of the year, consider an end of year donation to True. We'd be mighty happy to welcome your support. And come join us next week. We have people from Paper Mill Playhouse and also the Issaquah Theater, the Village Theater in Issaquah. We're going to be talking about the development of new musicals in yet another aspect of it. I've scheduled a lot of stuff about musicals right now, but it's just something I'm really interested in, and I hope that you are too. We'll be doing other things as well in the future and talking about other things besides musicals, I promise. But thank you for joining us, and hope you'll come back and be with us.